The early hours of January 4th, 2025, brought one of the most intense aerial confrontations over Russian territory since the war began. As the nation slowly stirred from its extended New Year holiday, the skies above Moscow and more than a dozen regions erupted with the traces of interceptor fire and the distant thunder of explosions. What unfolded was not merely another exchange in a conflict that has stretched across nearly 3 years, but a demonstration of Ukraine's expanding capacity to reach deep into Russian heartland, with consequences that rippled through military installations, civilian infrastructure, and the daily lives of millions. The Russian Ministry of Defense announced in its morning briefing that air defense systems had successfully intercepted 253 Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles during the overnight period. The number itself was staggering, representing one of the largest single drone assaults documented throughout the entire war. The drones approached from multiple vectors, forcing Russian military assets to engage across a geographical expanse stretching from the western border regions all the way to the capital itself. According to the ministry's statement, 11 of these aircraft were brought down specifically over Moscow Oblast, the administrative region surrounding the Russian capital. 3 additional drones were intercepted while approaching Moscow proper, their wreckage falling in areas where emergency services were quickly dispatched to assess and secure the crash sites. Moscow Mayor Sergey Sobyanin took to social media shortly after dawn to reassure residents that no casualties had been reported within the city limits and that damage from falling debris appeared minimal. His message carried the careful tone of an official attempting to project calm while acknowledging an undeniable reality. The war that began in distant Ukrainian fields had once again arrived at Russia's political and cultural center. The mayor's office coordinated with federal aviation authorities as 2 of Moscow's major airports, Vnukovo and Zhukovsky, implemented temporary flight restrictions during the height of the drone activity. These restrictions, initially described as brief precautionary measures, would cascade into one of the most significant disruptions to Russian air travel in recent memory. Passengers who had planned to travel on January 4th, the first working day following the holiday break, found themselves confronting a transportation nightmare. Russia's Federal Aviation Agency, Rosaviatsia, began compiling data as reports flooded in from the 3 primary airports serving the Moscow metropolitan area, Domodedovo, Sheremetyevo, and Zhukovsky. The scale of the disruption became apparent as the hours passed. According to agency calculations based on real-time flight tracking systems and airport departure boards, approximately 460 flights experienced delays of varying duration. Of these, 142 flights were delayed by more than 2 hours, leaving thousands of passengers stranded in terminals or scrambling to rebook connections. Another 25 flights were canceled entirely, their slots abandoned as airlines and airport authorities worked to manage the backlog created by the overnight restrictions. The timing could hardly have been worse for Russia's aviation sector. The extended New Year holiday period traditionally sees heavy travel as families reunite and business operations resume after the festive pause. Airports had been preparing for elevated passenger volumes, and the sudden imposition of airspace closures created a bottleneck that would take most of the day to clear. Travelers interviewed by Russian media outlets described scenes of confusion and frustration, with limited information available about when normal operations might resume and little clarity on compensation or rebooking procedures. The disruption served as a stark reminder of how deeply the war's effects have penetrated civilian life far from the front lines, transforming routine travel into an exercise shadowed by military considerations. Rosaviatsia officials attempted to frame the situation in terms that emphasized resilience and capability. In statements to state media, agency representatives noted that despite the scope of the attack and the resulting airspace closures, the Russian air transport system had demonstrated its ability to manage external disruptions and eventually restore normal operations. The message carried an implicit acknowledgement that such disruptions have become, if not routine, then at least a recurring feature of life in wartime Russia. 2 days earlier, on January 2nd, 4 Russian airports had similarly been forced to suspend operations due to drone activity. Restrictions had been imposed at Samara, Penza, Domodedovo, and Zhukovsky airports, with airspace closures also affecting the regions of Ivanovo and Yaroslavl. The pattern suggested a deliberate Ukrainian strategy of sustained pressure designed not merely to strike military targets, but to impose cumulative costs on Russian civilian infrastructure and economic activity. Beyond Moscow, the drone assault touched nearly every region of western and central Russia. Air defense batteries engaged targets over Bryansk, Oryol, Kursk, Rostov, Belgorod, Tula, Kaluga, Voronezh, and Lipetsk oblasts. Each interception represented a moment when Russian military commanders faced the calculation of whether incoming aircraft posed threats significant enough to warrant defensive fire, with the attendant risks of debris falling on populated areas. The geographical spread of the attacks forced Russian air defense assets to operate across multiple sectors simultaneously, stretching coordination and response capabilities in ways that revealed both the system's reach and its potential vulnerabilities. It was in Lipetsk Oblast, however, that the night's events moved beyond disruption and delay into the realm of strategic consequence. The city of Yelets, located approximately 400 kilometers south of Moscow, came under direct assault as Ukrainian drones penetrated local defenses. The target was not a military base in the conventional sense, nor a logistics hub or command facility. Instead, the drones struck at JSC Energia, a defense industrial plant whose role in Russia's military supply chain had evidently drawn Kyiv's attention. Shortly after the attack, witnesses in Yelets reported seeing thick black smoke rising from the facility's location, visible against the winter sky from considerable distances. Video footage began appearing on Russian social media platforms and messaging channels, showing flames and dense smoke columns that suggested significant fire damage. Independent Russian media outlets, operating within the constraints imposed by wartime censorship, but still capable of gathering local information, moved quickly to verify the reports. Astra, a Russian investigative journalism project that has continued reporting on sensitive domestic issues throughout the war, confirmed through its open-source intelligence analysts that the fire was indeed located at the Energia plant. Analysts georeferenced footage posted by eyewitnesses, determining that videos had been filmed approximately 900 meters from the facility itself, consistent with the plant's known location on the outskirts of Yelets. The distance and angle of the footage allowed for verification, while also indicating the intensity of the blaze, visible and identifiable from nearly a kilometer away. JSC Energia occupies a specialized niche within Russia's defense industrial complex. The plant manufactures chemical power sources, a category that encompasses various types of batteries and energy storage systems used across military and civilian applications. According to corporate information available prior to the war and technical documentation that has circulated in defense industry publications, Energia's product line includes batteries specifically designed for unmanned aerial vehicles, power systems for aviation applications, and energy storage solutions for naval vessels. The plant's output feeds directly into Russia's ability to field and maintain the very drones and aircraft that conduct operations over Ukraine, making it a logical target for Ukrainian strike planners seeking to degrade Russian military capability at its source, rather than merely engaging deployed forces. The strategic logic behind targeting defense industrial facilities, rather than frontline military installations, represents an evolution in Ukrainian operational thinking. Throughout 2024 and into early 2025, Ukrainian forces have increasingly directed long-range strike capabilities against targets deep inside Russia, focusing on refineries, ammunition depots, air bases, and manufacturing centers. These strikes aim to create cumulative effects that constrain Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations, forcing military planners to divert resources toward homeland defense and compelling industrial facilities to operate under the constant threat of attack. The strike on Energia fits within this broader campaign, one that seeks to impose costs across the entire depth of Russian territory rather than confining combat effects to the immediate front lines. Russian authorities in Lipetsk Oblast provided limited official comment on the Energia attack. Regional Governor Igor Artemonov acknowledged that drone activity had occurred and that emergency services were responding, but declined to provide specifics regarding damage to the facility or potential impacts on production. This reticence followed a pattern established earlier in the war, where Russian officials have generally avoided detailed discussion of successful Ukrainian strikes against military-industrial targets, preferring to emphasize air defense successes and minimize public awareness of vulnerabilities. The silence surrounding the Energia strike suggested that the attack had achieved at least some measure of its intended effect, potentially damaging production capacity or infrastructure critical to the plant's operations. While the Energia strike captured attention for its strategic implications, the human cost of the night's events manifested most clearly in Russia's border regions, where the proximity to Ukraine continues to expose civilian populations to direct risk. In Kursk Oblast, a Ukrainian drone struck the village of Novi Nikolaevka, killing a 55-year-old man in what local authorities described as a direct hit on a residential area. Regional Governor Alexander Kinstein announced the death on his official Telegram channel, offering condolences to the victim's family and friends, while noting that no words could adequately address such loss. The killing underscored the grim reality that even as Ukrainian forces target military and industrial infrastructure, the weapons employed in such operations can and do claim civilian lives, whether through targeting decisions, navigational errors, or the inherent imprecision of certain munitions. Further west in Belgorod Oblast, 3 civilians sustained injuries from drone strikes during the same period. Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov reported the casualties through his own social media channels, part of a communication pattern that has emerged among Russian regional officials who now regularly update local populations on attacks, casualties, and damage. Belgorod Oblast has experienced some of the most sustained cross-border shelling and drone activity of any Russian region, its proximity to Ukrainian-controlled territory making it particularly vulnerable to strikes launched with minimal warning time. For residents of Belgorod city and surrounding towns, the war is not an abstraction debated in Moscow or viewed through sanitized television reports, but an immediate and recurring threat that shapes daily decisions about movement, shelter, and safety. The casualty figures from Kursk and Belgorod Oblasts added to a grim tally that has accumulated throughout the conflict. While the scale of civilians suffering in Ukraine dwarfs that experienced within Russia, the deaths and injuries occurring in Russian border regions represent a dimension of the war that Russian authorities have struggled to manage politically. These casualties complicate the Kremlin's narrative framing of the conflict as a distant special military operation conducted on foreign soil, instead bringing the reality of warfare directly to Russian citizens whose lives have been upended by violence they never anticipated experiencing on their own territory. The Russian Ministry of Defense, in its subsequent briefings, sought to emphasize the effectiveness of air defense operations rather than dwell on the attacks that succeeded in reaching their targets. Ministry statements noted that in the 24-hour period encompassing the major assault, more than 210 unmanned aerial vehicles had been intercepted over Russian regions. Between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. Moscow time on January 4th alone, air defense systems destroyed an additional 41 drones attempting to penetrate Russian airspace. The ministry provided a regional breakdown of these interceptions: 14 drones destroyed over Kursk Oblast, 7 over Moscow Oblast, 6 over Ryazan Oblast, 4 each heading toward Belgorod and Lipetsk Oblasts, 3 toward Vladimir Oblast, 2 over Tula Oblast, and 1 over Voronezh Oblast. The statistics served dual purposes, demonstrating both the scale of the Ukrainian effort and the claimed effectiveness of Russian defenses. Yet the very need to intercept such numbers of aircraft revealed as much about Ukrainian capabilities as about Russian defenses. The ability to launch 253 drones in a single coordinated operation represented a significant escalation in Ukraine's long-range strike capacity. Throughout the war, observers have tracked Ukraine's development and deployment of domestically produced unmanned aerial vehicles capable of reaching targets hundreds of kilometers from the front lines. These systems, developed in Ukrainian workshops and factories, often working under wartime conditions, have evolved from rudimentary converted civilian drones into increasingly sophisticated platforms capable of carrying meaningful payloads across strategic distances. The January 4th attack demonstrated that Ukraine now possesses not only individual strike capabilities, but the capacity to mass these systems in operations that can overwhelm localized defenses through sheer numbers, forcing Russian commanders to make difficult prioritization decisions about which threats to engage and which regions to defend most heavily. The strategic implications extend beyond the immediate tactical results of any single attack. Each successful Ukrainian strike deep inside Russia serves multiple purposes. Militarily, it degrades Russian capability by destroying infrastructure, equipment, and materiel that would otherwise support operations in Ukraine. Economically, it imposes costs through direct damage, production disruptions, and the necessity of diverting resources toward homeland defense rather than offensive operations. Psychologically, it challenges Russian public perceptions of security and invulnerability, bringing the consequences of the war to regions that might otherwise view the conflict as distant and abstract. Politically, it complicates the Kremlin's narrative management, forcing acknowledgement of vulnerabilities that contradict official messaging about Russian military superiority and control. For Ukrainian military planners, the campaign of strikes into Russian territory represents an attempt to shift the calculus of the war itself. Unable to match Russian advantages in manpower and artillery ammunition through direct frontline engagement alone, Ukrainian forces have sought to leverage asymmetric capabilities that exploit Russia's vast geography and the challenges of defending industrial and military infrastructure spread across thousands of kilometers. By forcing Russia to defend a deep rear area, Ukraine aims to dilute the concentration of Russian combat power at the front and create dilemmas that have no perfect solution. Every air defense battery positioned to protect Moscow is one not available to provide cover for advancing ground forces in Donetsk. Every fighter aircraft scrambled to intercept drones over Lipetsk is one not conducting close air support missions in Zaporizhzhia. The strategy does not guarantee Ukrainian success, but it transforms the nature of the conflict from a purely attritional struggle along fortified front lines into a multi-dimensional contest that plays to different strengths. The disruption to civilian air travel, while secondary to the military dimensions of the assault, illustrated how completely the war has penetrated Russian society beyond the immediate combat zones. Business travelers found meetings canceled or severely delayed. Families attempting to return home after holiday gatherings discovered their plans upended by events entirely outside their control. Airport staff and airline employees worked through extended shifts, attempting to manage passenger frustration while operating under constraints imposed by military necessity. The accumulated frustration and inconvenience, multiplied across hundreds of affected flights and thousands of passengers, contributed to a broader erosion of normalcy that has characterized Russian civilian life since February 2022. Aviation industry analysts noted that the disruptions on January 4th represented one of the most significant impacts on Moscow air travel since the war's early months, when Ukrainian drone activity first demonstrated the capacity to reach the capital region. The comparison highlighted how the conflict's effects have evolved over time. Initial responses to Ukrainian long-range strikes were characterized by shock and novelty, each incident treated as an exceptional event demanding immediate attention and explanation. By early 2025, such incidents had become sufficiently routine that the primary concern shifted from the fact of the attacks themselves to their operational impact and the effectiveness of responses. This normalization of wartime conditions within Russian civilian life represented a profound transformation in social expectations and daily experience, one that will likely shape Russian society for years regardless of how or when the conflict concludes. As daylight spread across Moscow on January 4th and airport operations gradually resumed a semblance of normal scheduling, the immediate crisis began to recede. Flights took off carrying delayed passengers toward their destinations. Emergency crews in Lipetsk continued working to secure the damaged Energia facility and assess the extent of fire damage. Regional governors in Kursk and Belgorod coordinated assistance for injured civilians and made arrangements for the funeral of the man killed in Novy Nikolaevka. the rhythm of wartime life reasserted itself, characterized by the necessity of moving forward, even as the threat of further attacks remained ever present. The events of January 3rd and 4th will be recorded as another chapter in a conflict that has already generated countless such chapters, each contributing to a larger narrative still being written. The strategic contest between Ukrainian strike capabilities and Russian defensive measures continues to evolve as both sides adapt to lessons learned and develop new approaches. Ukraine's ability to mass drones in attacks numbering in the hundreds suggests that the campaign of deep strikes will not only continue but potentially intensify, especially as Ukrainian domestic production capacity expands and as Western partners potentially provide systems capable of reaching even farther into Russian territory. Russia, in response, will continue refining and expanding its air defense networks, attempting to create layered protections that can intercept threats at multiple stages while minimizing the disruption such defensive operations impose on civilian life and economic activity. The strike on the Energia defense plant in Yelets, the disruption of air travel across the Moscow region, and the continued casualties in border areas all reflect different dimensions of a war that has refused to conform to the expectations or timelines envisioned by either side when it began. What was launched as a special military operation intended to achieve swift objectives has metastasized into a protracted conflict with no clear resolution in sight. The capacity of Ukrainian forces to reach targets hundreds of kilometers inside Russia was not anticipated in the war's opening phases, just as many other developments have challenged initial assumptions and forced continuous adaptation. The events of early January 2025 stand as evidence that nearly 3 years after the war's beginning, its capacity to generate surprise, impose costs, and reshape circumstances remains undiminished. This account draws primarily on official Russian government statements, reports from Russian aviation authorities, Russian independent media, reporting particularly from outlets like Astra, open-source intelligence analysis of video and photographic evidence from the attacks, and Ukrainian military announcements regarding operations. The most current information indicates Ukrainian drone strikes against Russian territory continue with significant frequency, that defense industrial facilities remain priority targets, and that disruptions to civilian infrastructure persist as recurring consequences of the ongoing conflict.